Dictators, political leaders who hold absolute power across a country and who enforce their will and agenda onto people through brutal means. Often dictatorships are linked to tyranny and slaughter. For example, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin organised huge purges of his own military and population, leading to the deaths of millions. But many dictators throughout history have encountered deaths and executions that were ruthless and brutal, and they fell rapidly from power, and also shockingly. Some were executed by their own people, and in front of those who they had held in submission for so long, and a few of these executions were even captured on camera and were then shown on live television for the world to see. One of the most shocking moments of the 21st century was the execution of a dictator, Saddam Hussein, which was captured on a mobile phone and was then shown on multiple news stations, and the sight of the former Iraqi dictator on the gallows was a haunting one, and showed that he went to his death putting up a fight. In this video we look at some instances in which dictators were executed on live television, and what the reaction to this was. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Nicolae Ceausescu was the dictator of Romania and the final communist leader of the country. He rose to power through political manipulations and eventually became the first president of the Social Republic of Romania. His time in power was one in which he tried to carve his nation away from the influence of the Soviet Union, and this to begin with saw him experience a significant amount of popularity within the country. A cult of personality emerged around him, and he was married to Elena Ceausescu, a sharp-tongued woman who was viewed as the mother of the nation. Together the pair had an iron grip over Romania, and throughout their years in power, the country became one of the most repressive nations in the Eastern Bloc. Ceausescu's secret police, known as the Securitate, were responsible for huge surveillance operations and a massive amount of intimidation. Anyone suspected of dissenting to the dictator found themselves arrested, beaten and thrown into prison, sometimes without even a trial. They were responsible for thousands of deaths, and it was believed that 1 in 4 Romanian citizens was actually an informant to the secret police, meaning that people inside of the country could not trust anyone. Ceausescu also controlled the media and the press inside of Romania, but over time his economic policies crippled the country and plunged many people into poverty and struggle. He tried to export much of the country's agriculture and industrial production to repay the debts the nation had incurred, and with this many people saw a huge drop in their standard of living. But he continued to go on state visits to other countries, even meeting American presidents and the Queen of the United Kingdom, Elizabeth II. But all would come crushing down in December 1989 for the Ceausescus. Anti-governmental protests broke out in the city of Timisoara, and Ceausescu saw this as a political threat, and with this he ordered his army and military to even open fire on people protesting. Quickly the protests spread all across the country, and many were killed by Ceausescu's army. The demonstrations reached the capital of Bucharest, and a full-blown revolution broke out, and the army at some point even turned their back on the dictator. Ceausescu famously gave on TV an ill-informed final public speech in front of bussed-in supporters of him, and many of the crowd heckled him, and fireworks or gunshots broke out while he was speaking. It was clear to anyone watching that the Ceausescus were fearful, and when the crowd scattered, they tried to hide out inside the Central Committee building. Rioters then broke into this building, and Ceausescu and his wife were rescued by helicopter from the roof of it, but they were then captured after the pilot told them they were on their own. Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu were then put on trial, and this was then shown on TV, and the pair could not accept the jurisdiction of the court. They thought it was false, and that it had no legal standing. However, were both condemned to death. Set up outside of the military barracks in Targovist were a number of cameras for Romanian television to capture the execution of the dictator and his wife. These were staffed by production crews, and they were there to show the people that their dictator was dead. On Christmas Day 1989, the 71-year-old dictator and his wife, shortly after trial, were taken to the side of the building. They had been tied with their arms behind their backs, and they were then ordered next to the wall. Nicolae began singing a communist anthem, and Elena screamed slurs at the paratroopers who had been selected to carry out the executions. Now the television cameras were ready, However, the paratroopers opened fire so quickly that the initial shots that began the execution were actually missed, and the television cameras caught the final moments of the execution. But it was clear to the world that the Ceausescus were dead, and the dictator and his wife had been overthrown once and for all. Saddam Hussein was the world's most wanted man at the beginning of the 21st century. The dictator of Iraq was accused of harbouring weapons of mass destruction, which it was believed by the Americans he would pass on to terrorist organisations to then use in attacks. But he was someone who committed huge numbers of war crimes, and the people of Iraq knew that dissenting against Saddam could result in their execution and torture within sites such as Abu Ghraib prison. George Bush, the American president, gave Saddam an ultimatum, following the September 11 attacks, to either resign or face invasion. Ultimately, Iraq was invaded by a US-led coalition force, and within a number of weeks, the Iraqi government collapsed, as did the military, with the fighting picked up by guerrilla groups. Saddam himself, upon the invasion beginning, went into hiding, and it was known that he was high-value target number 1, the Ace of Spades. US forces were established to capture Saddam, but there were a number of different raids to try and snatch him. Ultimately, he was found hiding in a spider hole under a farm by pure coincidence, as a US soldier kicked out a rug, revealing a hatch. Saddam was then wrestled out of the small underground lair, and he was paraded in front of the world's cameras. He was shown undergoing a medical examination, which in recent years has been criticised and said to have violated the Geneva Convention, as this treatment was said to have unnecessarily been aimed at humiliating him. He was eventually handed over to the Iraqis for a trial, which was most probably influenced by the Americans. Saddam was, it's believed, responsible for the disappearance and murder of around 250,000 people inside of Iraq, and he led the country through complete control. Ultimately, though, it was a specific war crime committed against the people in Dujal that led to his sentence of death. There was significant evidence against him relating to this, and following his trial, he was sent to death row to await execution. Now, the execution of Saddam took place around 5:50 a.m. in the morning of the 30th of December 2006 within the walls of Camp Justice, a joint US and Iraqi military base. He was executed on the gallows, and this was something which wasn't intended to be filmed. But someone who was acting as a witness filmed the execution of Saddam on their mobile phone, and this showed in grainy footage the dictator walking up to the staircase onto the gallows. It also showed 2 balaclava-covered executioners placing him over the trapdoor and then securing the noose. It was claimed that it was a guard who actually filmed the execution, and during this footage, it showed that people were shouting at Saddam and hurling insults at him whilst he was on the gallows. Saddam even replied at one point, "God damn you." The footage of this was then allegedly sold to media companies, and within minutes, millions of people had seen the final moments of the Iraqi dictator, and some news channels even showed the whole execution, as in Saddam going through the trapdoor, and also the aftermath. The government also released images of Saddam's body wrapped in a shroud, but the broadcast of the execution shocked many people. Colonel Gaddafi was one of the most eccentric dictators of the 20th century, and he was someone who rose to power within Libya through revolution. He was a military officer and transformed the country into a new socialist state, and was also the head of the military and the Revolutionary Committee. He was known for being involved in the alleged bombings of aircraft, such as the Lockerbie bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, and he developed a hostile relationship with many countries. Libya was bombed by the Americans in 1986, and strict sanctions were imposed on the nation, but throughout the following decades, Gaddafi emerged from the cold of the political stage, and he rose to become the chairperson of the Africa Union. He had a huge cult of personality, and he surrounded himself with a group of female bodyguards, but he was known for human rights violations and committing many crimes himself. But in 2011, during the Arab Spring, protests broke out in eastern Libya, as people were frustrated with the government's corruption and the rising unemployment. Eventually, civil war broke out, and NATO intervened on the side of the anti-Gaddafi forces, and with this, Gaddafi was now one of the world's most wanted men. His forces were pushed back, and rebels continued to take cities and towns, and Gaddafi retreated to his hometown of Sirte. He continued to broadcast defiant messages through foreign television, and was surrounded by his son and a bodyguard force. But a convoy on the 20th of October 2011 was noticed by NATO forces, and it was then bombed. The convoy, indeed carrying Gaddafi, scattered, and he retreated to drainage pipes with his bodyguards, who were fighting rebels. He had been injured in the blast from a grenade and was very bloodied. Now, despite this not being filmed by a proper television crew, yet again using a mobile phone or several phones, rebels filmed the moment that Gaddafi was captured. He was heavily bleeding and was shown in a state of pain and anguish. A video emerged showing Gaddafi being stabbed in the backside with a stick or a knife, and he was then dragged to the front of a pickup truck and was then dropped. This was all captured. The crowd continued to beat and attack him, and he was shown covered in blood slumped upon the leg of a rebel. At the time of his capture, Gaddafi was still alive, but the actions of the crowd that day finished him off. People went crazy, and he was allegedly shot in the head and also in the stomach, these wounds killing him. Another video was stated to have shown fighters hovering around his lifeless body, posing for photographs and yanking his limp head up and down by the hair. He was then stripped by his captors, and his body was taken to Misrata, and it was further photographed, where it was shown that he had been shot in the head and the abdomen indeed. But further punishment came for his corpse, as he was displayed in public for days in a large freezer, and within a few days the remains began to decay very quickly, and it was said that the stench was terrible. Now, the mobile phone footage was shown all around the world on live television and on news channels, as this was sent in immediately by rebels to show that the Libyan dictator, a man known for aiding and facilitating terror attacks against the West, was well and truly dead, being executed by a group of rebels. Now, Benito Mussolini was the fascist dictator of Italy who influenced Adolf Hitler later when he rose to power. Mussolini became one of the most powerful people across Europe, and his forces would launch wars in Africa and also back up the Spanish during the Civil War. Throughout World War II, he ended up siding with the Germans, forming the Axis alliance, but he later fell from power during the war as the Italian forces were defeated. He was later rescued by Germany in the Gran Sasso raid, as he was captured by his enemies and was placed in control of the collaborationist Italian Social Republic. At the end of the war, Mussolini was captured by partisans, and he was taken out to the side of a road near Lake Como, where he was shot and executed alongside his long-standing mistress, Clara Patasci. Now, this part of the execution was not shown on television, but what came next was captured by American videographers. The body was taken into Milan and was strung upside down from a service station, and the crowd threw things and jeered at him. Before, the bodies had been beaten also on the floor of the Piazza Loreto. These scenes were then shown around the world in a limited capacity, as television was not readily available to those at the time, but the footage of that day, still today, 8 years on, is rather shocking. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.